is thank you very, very much to Arts Council England. It is due to the Arts Council England that I am doing this. They very kindly gave me a grant so that I could spend some time thinking about Duncan Williamson. So Duncan Williamson was an amazing Scottish traveller, tradition bearer, a storyteller and a ballad singer. And I was lucky enough to be his apprentice. And he gave me several boxes of reel-to-reel tapes. And this year for me has been about digitising those tapes, listening to them and having time to think about them, to revisit that time that I had. I'm 44 now, and I was 18 when I first stayed with Duncan. And so I'm a completely different person. And I'm learning different things from my apprenticeship now than I did at the time. And of course, there are all sorts of questions that come up now that I think, I wish I'd asked that. And I didn't. But this is time for me to discuss the things that I'm learning and the stories that I heard, and to just generally think about the tradition, and ask other people to come into that conversation and that discussion with me. So I started making some podcasts, and then lockdown came and we all discovered Zoom, which I didn't know about before. And so every week I ask somebody to come and have a conversation with me about some aspect of the tradition. So the Arts Council England have made that possible, but also Get a Word in Edgeways. So I am using the Get a Word in Edgeways snazzy, shiny Zoom account. So thank you very, very much to them as well, which means that I can do all these lovely things. And I'm very pleased that you like the Taking the Traditions on. Thank you very much for putting it all up. Just checking. You're eating. Yeah, so everybody is making themselves very comfortable. I'm very happy about this. Ratatouille and drinking gin. Well, I'm going to join you, I think, in the gin in about 50 minutes, Kat. That would be fantastic. And we've got people from all over, which is marvellous. So hello to Italy, hello to New York, and hello to Harbon and to Shropshire and Wales and all over. And I'm now going to finally get cracking and actually introduce my wonderful guest. I'm going to have to do the brief version because his CV is just dazzling and incredibly long. I'm very excited about the erudite nature of my guest tonight. I feel like I'm going up in the world. So my guest tonight is the incredibly talented and erudite Joseph Sobol. Now, Joseph is currently the director of Geeks, which is just the best name for departments ever, but it stands for the George Ewart Evans Centre for Storytelling. So he's now based in Cardiff, but as you'll know, if you don't already know Joseph, when you hear him talk, you'll realise that he is not Welsh by birth. So he's come across the water from America, where he was teaching the master's degree in storytelling. Was it just called storytelling?
Well, there was some controversy about that. We'd say controversy. It was cloned off of a reading program, and it very quickly turned out that the storytellers who came to that program were a different breed altogether, and they sort of seized the territory for themselves. And so for us, it was the storytelling degree, but for the folks over in reading who had gotten it all starting, it was reading/storytelling. So we got to wrestle over that for years and years and years.
But there are quite a lot of people in the world who have a master's degree in storytelling, which I think is just fabulous.
And there are about 250 in the US, some from Canada, there's one from South Africa, one from Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan.
I know there's one from Bristol.
There's one, which one from Bristol?
Kat?
Kat, lovely girl that she was, never finished.
Oh, did she never finish a dissertation?
No, she played with it like a cat and then dropped it.
Oh, well. I heard really interesting things from her while she was working on it. So you have all this academic side, but you started but you've come absolutely from a performing background as a ballad singer and a musician and a storyteller. And we're gonna, sorry, Kat, I know you're not that Cat. It's Cat Quatermass that I was talking about, but and
Right.
yes, no, not Cat Wetherell. Different.
Absolutely
We have different
not.
cats tonight.
Yeah, there are lots of cats in the asylum.
Yeah, cats. Another lovely storyteller, but yes, not Cat Wetherell. So there is this kind of this way, and you've done a lot of studying on the academic side, but it's come just from a genuine and love of storytelling, from just listening and telling and
Yeah.
and the thing that we've been talking about a lot and we really have in common is Jack, which is what we're going to spend quite a lot of time talking about tonight, I think.
Yeah.
Because obviously I'm coming to this from a point of view of the Scottish travellers and spending a lot of time with Duncan and him really living in a Jack lifestyle. But all of those stories went across the water when all the Scottish emigrated, and they took all of their stories with them, and those stories have maybe changed, but they're certainly there in this. So how did you first come to storytelling, and what kind of bit you and got it all started?
Okay, well, storytelling happened to me when I was playing music on Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco in 1977. And we were just knocking off for the day with a box full of quarters jingling in our arms. Those things are heavy, but that was our pay as buskers. And we came across this fella who was just magnetic. He was telling a story that he was spinning out of the air, and he was going down on his knees and kissing the ground and taking a pinch of earth and waving it around. He had balloons tied to his suspenders, and he was just an amazing apparition on the street. And I never found out his name, but I was totally entranced by this. What's he doing? I had no name for it. And then about a year and a half later, I had just been kicked out of my esoteric group. We were marooned on a sandbar off of Broward County, Florida, and I started hitchhiking up the coast. And I got to Charleston, South Carolina on the first day of the Spoleto Festival with a guitar on my back and a sign kit in my hand. And I was abducted into this little festival group that was going around. This is Piccolo Spoleto in 1978, it is now. And this group was a couple of musicians, a juggler and fire eater, and a couple of storytellers. And one of those storytellers was this guy that I had seen on Fisherman's Wharf a year and a half before. And his name was Brother Blue, okay? And he was a madman in the spirit, right? Whose vehicle was storytelling. So he got me started. And that was at a time when a lot of storytelling, especially, I then moved to California and started doing it there. But storytelling in California was like sort of a suburb of the New Age. And we were all doing this in order to bring in a new consciousness to the planet. And that was great. But I had this urge to find out what storytelling was about in the old age, just to ground it a little, because the New Age storytelling could be a little, sort of extraterrestrial. And so I did what a lot of people before me had done. I moved to North Carolina. That was what a lot of folkies did back in the day to find authentic folklore, because North Carolina is kind of the western section of North Carolina is cut through by the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge. And was a historic home of a lot of traditional ballad singers, tale tellers, banjo pickers, all kinds of traditional folklore. So, my people, I come from a scholarly people. And when we reach a crossroads in life, we go to graduate school, or we go find a Rebbe or something like that. And so my Rebbe was the folklore program at Chapel Hill. And the first thing they did when I came in there and announced that I was interested in studying traditional storytelling was they sat me down in front of a cassette player that had field recordings of Ray Hicks, who was an old Appalachian storyteller from up on Beech Mountain, North Carolina. And they introduced me to this Jack Tale tradition through Ray's voice. And that really just rewired my brain, because you hear that voice and it's just steeped in wood smoke and imagery. And he's not telling by memory, which is something that you can get confused about in the contemporary storytelling world. Not around here. I think British storytellers are very attuned to improvisatory language and spontaneous languaging of story. But in America, there was a whole lot of oral interp. Basically, there was a whole library tradition of reciting stories from memory, from books. And I learned from Ray what that spontaneous story discourse was about. I learned it first off the tape, and then I started going to the National Storytelling Festival, which was right over the mountain in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And when I did, it was still a pretty small festival. This is now 1983, 84.
So when did the National Festival start?
Well, that festival began in 1973. And the first person that they brought as a kind of a featured teller was, the first person was a guy named Jerry Clower, who was actually, this is perfect for a storyteller. He was a fertilizer salesman. And he had become famous through, he was a regional supervisor for this big fertilizer company. And he would tell traditional stories from his home place in Mississippi. And he became a kind of fixture on the Grand Ole Opry. His name was Jerry Clower. So he was the first guy to be featured at the festival. But the second day of the festival, they went looking for some other storytellers, and they stumbled out across Ray Hicks. And every year they would send a car up to Beech Mountain to get Ray. It was about an hour and a half, 2 hours from Jonesboro, depending on which route you took. And it was way out of the way. And the paved road ended and the dirt road ended, and it was just, you're clattering over cobblestones, and you get to this ridge, and there's Ray's house. So the second year that I was at the festival, I got the assignment of picking Ray up and going to his house and bringing him back down to Jonesboro for the festival. And that was a complete awakening for me, because, I got to experience Ray in his natural habitat. The stage was not that. The stage was a place where he managed to transcend, because of the force of his personality. He could bring it over. And a lot of traditional storytellers couldn't. But Ray just had this extraordinary presence. He was almost 7 feet tall. He was beanpole skinny. He always wore the same pair of overalls and an army shirt and a floppy hat. And he was on fire with stories, and the spirit, in a way, he was a lot like Brother Blue in that way. He wasn't just telling story. He was kind of preaching the word of the old tales. For those who want to see what I'm talking about here.
Yes.
I brought along my favorite picture of Ray, so I'll show that to the assembled faithful. Let's see, can you see it?
You're right a little bit. And I'm gonna put you bigger so we can see it properly. That's me. Let's spotlight you and spotlight Ray.
Okay, you got it?
Yeah.
That's Ray Hicks and his little wife, Rosa, up on Beech Mountain. That's right behind their house. And you see that soulful look in his face. He was just an extraordinary human being. And when he told, there's me. You can get rid of me now. Bring back, I prefer looking at you, honestly, Amy.
Okay, well, everybody else is seeing us side by side, and obviously you can change things so that you can have it as you like on your screen. So you may need to just press gallery view.
Okay, there we both are.
Great.
I'll get rid of the chat for the moment. So Ray, when he would tell, he would weave together his own life experience and the experience of his ancestors and fold them into the stories themselves, the stories of Jack. And they were very present for him. and they were part of a kind of a spiritual autobiography. So I think Duncan was the same way.
I was just thinking you could just totally take out Ray's name and stick Duncan's in, because you were absolutely describing his connection with those stories and how he lived those stories. And certainly for the Scottish travellers, Jack is a traveller, and he sort of held up as this is your guide to life, this is your education, these are the ways, you know, the underdog comes over, this is how you need to use your wits, this is who you need to be to survive.
Exactly. Ray said that to Barbara McDermott, who was a folklorist who worked a lot in the Appalachians and then moved to Scotland and worked with Duncan and Stanley. And there's a beautiful old article that Barbara wrote about Ray where he says, it takes Jack to live. That's one of my favorite Ray quotes. He says, it takes Jack to live. I could have been Jack, you could have been Jack, anybody who has a mind and a heart for it. And so that's how he told those stories, you know, and he related them very much to his own personal experience and to the experience of his listeners, so that he could sit on a stage at Jonesboro and there'd be, you know, first few festivals, there were just, you know, 50 or 60 people in the audience. But by the end of Ray's life, by the last time he was there in 1999, I think was his last festival.
I saw him and it would have been 94, 93, actually no, in 93.
Yeah.
I saw him at Jonesboro, and of course, I mean, I can understand the word he said.
Exactly.
I had never seen a crowd like that for storytelling. It was just total eye-opener. I was sat in the middle of a marquee with nearly 2,000 other people, and this is a storytelling festival? Was completely, I'd never experienced anything like it.
Yeah.
And everybody was hanging on every word he said. I was trying to, and I did get to understand him by the end of the festival, but
well, that was the thing. There'd be 1,000 people in a tent, and most of them would not understand the actual language, but they were so transfixed by the presence and by the passion, the kind of total immersion that he radiated with those stories, that it didn't really matter. They were still laughing at all the right places, even though it was like, you know, storytelling in a second language.
Well, because that was going to be my next question was, you know, I was really astounded that many people understood him, because, I mean, the whole point, I mean, I think, you know, they say about the Appalachian Mountains is probably closer to Old English than any language that is spoken in Britain.
Yeah.
Because it stayed quite pure in the Appalachian.
Right. It was an isolated language community. And, you know, they use antique phrases like, you know, blood and Ewans and bedads and, you know, all kinds of things that have kind of gone out of circulation in other places, including everywhere else in most other places in America. But, you know, it was that, but if you went to his house, this was an amazing thing to see, because I went up there a few times and I brought some friends, including some friends from California, a woman named Kathleen Zundell, who had been one of my first storytelling buddies out in Los Angeles. And for the first hour, Kathleen sat in the parlor listening to Ray, and Ray didn't stop. You know, he didn't pause to let anyone else take a conversational turn. That really wasn't his style. So she was just sitting there with her mouth hanging open, listening to Ray and listening to Ray and listening to Ray, not understanding a word he was saying. And he was going through, you know, some pretty intense repertoire pieces like the story of Cat and Mouse, which is a wonderful old Jack tale going back to Joseph and his brothers, really. And she was just sitting there, you know, letting it wash over her. And then we all went into the kitchen to have supper. And Rosa, the woman you saw in the photograph, the little tiny lady, she had made, you know, a traditional, we'd brought a ham, and they had collard greens and snap beans and cornbread and taters and all this down home food. And somehow sitting at the table and eating that stuff and listening to Ray, all of a sudden the dialect became crystal clear to Kathleen, and she understood every word. So we all, we went out to the parlor again, and he told for another several hours until we had to go. And everyone who's been up there remembers that Ray didn't stop. You had to say, well, Ray, we got to go. And he kept on going. And then 15 minutes later, you say, Ray, we've got to go. And he'd keep on going. And then another 10 minutes later, you say, Ray, we're going now. And he'd stand up and he'd keep on going. And he'd follow you out to the car, up the road, and still telling stories all the way. And, Connie Reagan Blake, who was a real good friend, she said that they would get in the car and actually turn around and start driving down the mountain. They'd see Ray in the taillights still telling stories. So that was pretty much
yeah, and yet he never wanted to leave, did he?
No. And in his last days, he had cancer, and he stopped going to the festival. But he had some hospice nurses who would come up, and I would visit him, and lots of people would visit him. And he'd be lying in bed in the parlor. They moved the bed they had a hospital bed in the parlor, and he would be talking the whole time. Now and then he would ask if he had a storytelling visitor. He'd say, "You try this one. I'm going to be finished soon, so you try telling that." And you'd start, and he'd say, and he'd just join right in, and pretty soon he'd be telling the story again. So that sort of lasted pretty much to the end.
Beautiful.
Well,
but he did. He came down. He was amazing because he came down and he told at the festival.
Yeah.
But he didn't really tell anywhere else, did he? Just at home and the festival.
He had gone a few places. He didn't like to travel far. He was not ever in really robust health, and in 75 he had a rather bad accident where his truck slid off the mountain and down the road and turned over, and he broke his back, and he had troubles with his prostate that eventually turned into cancer. And so he just didn't like going, or he didn't like traveling. He was a home person. He said they invited him on the Johnny Carson show at some point. And he said, if that Carson feller wants to talk to me so bad, let him come down here.
I love it. I'm guessing he never did, though.
No, he didn't. But, the Jim, was it McNeil or Lehrer, the guy who did the Story of English, from which you got some of your notions about Appalachian dialect, they did come down. Well, they did come down and they filmed Ray at his place, and there was a documentary film made in 74, 5. It's really hard to find now, but it's beautiful. Just a film of Ray in the woods picking galax, which is one of his cash crops, just to pick wild galax.
I have no idea what a galax is.
Galax, it was basically an ornamental that they'd use florists would use it for bouquets. It wasn't medicinal. Okay. He collected a lot of medicinal herbs. He had a lot of knowledge about that. But galax was an ornamental, and they'd sell it down in Boone for cash. And he was out there, and galax had a rhizome that went through the ground, and the leaves would die back in the winter, and then they'd come up in the spring. And Ray was out there picking, and he hadn't studied in any formal university, but he studied the book of life, is what he called it. And he was out there picking, and he'd say, these leaves, this galax, it's in the ground, and the shoots come up. And so these leaves I'm holding, they're the same as my ancestors, as the first settlers in these mountains. They're the same. And it's that way in spirit, that the roots are in spirit. And you and me, we come up off those roots, and then we'll die back, and we'll come back another time. So he arrived at this notion of reincarnation just through observing the galax leaves coming out from the rhizomes in the soil. And at the end, near the end of his life, he was talking about, he said, I'll be back in some form or another. I might be a tree, I might be a plant, I might be an animal, I don't know, it doesn't matter. And I said, what's heaven, Ray? He said, heaven's the planet. So he was pretty, he was an earth religionist with a Christian overlay, but it was pretty
Well, that was
fascinating.
also Duncan too.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a very similar
Yeah.
outlook on life, which I guess was an awful lot to do with the stories, actually.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, they're in there.
when that's your life model.
Yeah.
So was it from his father or his mother, or who did Ray learn the stories from?
Well, Ray credited the stories to his grandfather, John Benjamin Hicks, who was himself a grandson of a man named Council Harmon, who there were three main families on Beech Mountain, and they were all related and interrelated very intricately. But they were the Harmons, who were from German stock, from the Palatine. And there were the Hicks, which originally was Hix, which was from Somerset, I believe, from the southwest of England. And then there were the Wards, who were Scotch-Irish. They were from that plantation of Ulster, the Scottish Presbyterians who had been moved over to Ulster to colonize the place in the 1600s. And then they realized that they weren't any better off in Ireland than they'd been in Scotland. And they were being taxed by the English, and they didn't enjoy that. So they all got on ships, or a lot of them, and moved over to, first to either Pennsylvania or South Carolina. They came down the valley of Virginia or up through South Carolina into the mountains and got land grants and settled in. That was a pretty traditional route. The Germans came through Pennsylvania. The Scotch-Irish a lot came through Charleston, and they settled the mountains in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So there were those three branches. There was the German, the Scotch-Irish, and the English, and they all brought jacktails. They all had a character and stories that corresponded to that type. Maybe slightly different types, but they all blended. They basically intermarried the same way the people did. And they developed this repertoire of jacktails with several distinct subtypes. And this is what I got to studying when I was at Chapel Hill, both from listening to Ray, but also from and looking at, because a lot of people had studied Ray. A lot of people had studied that family tradition. And back in the 30s and 40s, there was a folklorist slash performer, a kind of a prototypical folk revivalist by the name of Richard Chase, who went up to Beech Mountain, and he also went to some of the communities across the Virginia line in Southwest Virginia in Wise County. And he was a great kind of a folklorist slash magpie. He would take these stories, and he considered himself the final arbiter of how they ought to go. And he made a series of books that became very popular. And one was called The Jack Tales, and the other was called The Grandfather Tales. And then a little later was a smaller book called American Folk Tales and Folk Songs. So Chase was a very powerful presence and a kind of a transmitter of these stories into the wider culture. And a lot of people learned stories from Chase, including people who had actual ancestors in that tradition, but the stories being there in the book made it accessible in a certain way, and also kind of carried a stamp of authority, the way books tend to do, and in some ways even took away the voice of the original transmitters. Now,
well, it literally did that as well to a certain extent, because Chase does not credit the people that he got them from, does it?
Actually, he does. And he had a real folklorist, a guy by the name of Herbert Halpert, who did write extensive notes in the back of both Jack Tales and Grandfather Tales. And if you look at those notes, you'll see both the original sources credited, the original people who told the stories to Chase, and you'll also see comparative notes. So it has that little scaffolding of folkloristic integrity in those books. But the voice of the stories was Chase's voice in those books. So Ray knew Chase, and he knew the stories that he got from his grandfather, John Benjamin, and he also would have heard Marshall Ward and Marshall Ward's father, Monroe Ward, and some of the Presnells, who was another family around there who told the stories. And they were all grandsons, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren of this kind of formative figure by the name of Council Harmon. Council Harmon was born around 1803 or 4 and died around in the 1880s. And he had he was like the J.S. Bach of Jack Tales. He had lots and lots and lots of children, and they had lots and lots and lots of children. And so all over those mountains, there were Council Harmon grandchildren who would be discovered here and there. And they sort of fanned out and really distributed that tradition all over that section of the Blue Ridge. So, I ran into some of the other Jack Tale tellers from that family, but I also ran into another very important figure who's still out there telling, who was another kind of a transitional or bridge figure. A guy, no, there was Kath asked, was it a male line? Not entirely, no. There were women storytellers, but there was something about the culture that made it difficult for people to show off. And males had an easier time holding the floor in gatherings. So
was that because all the women were usually cooking and...
Well, yeah, I mean, it was similar to Ray's household, where Rosa was in the back, in the kitchen, and she told stories,
okay, for
sure. But she didn't, it wasn't her way to hold the floor and take the spotlight.
And would they be telling Jack stories? Would the women be telling Jack stories? Would they have a different set of stories?
Some of them did. But most of the storytellers who are credited in the back of the Jack Tales are males. And that could be because the women would clam up when the folklorists were around. The folklorists were mostly male. There was one very important Jack Tale teller and ballad singer both, who was another of Council Harmon's grandchildren. And she was a woman named Jane Gentry. She lived from the probably 70s up until the 1940s or so. And she ran a boarding house in Hot Springs, North Carolina. And she worked part-time at a Presbyterian settlement school in that town. And when Cecil Sharp came through the mountains in 1917 collecting ballads, she gave him 62 songs right off the top of her head. And that wow, probably didn't scrape the bottom of her repertoire. So she was a well-known tradition bearer. And of course, Sharp never asked about stories, so he didn't get any. But a few years later, a folklorist named Isabel Gordon Carter happened to stay at the boarding house, and they got talking stories. And she took down basically the same repertoire of Jack Tales that Ray got from his grandfather. So they all knew the same stories. And Carter published them in 1925 in the Journal of American Folklore. And they're real short kind of summary versions, little telegraphic versions. But everybody had a different style and a different personality with the stories that came across. Like Ray's double first cousin was a fellow named Stanley Hicks, who was much better known as a dulcimer player and banjo player and instrument maker. And Stanley would tell the stories too, but a story that Ray would take 20 minutes on or half an hour, Stanley would tell in about 5. Just laughing the whole way, and amusing himself greatly. But he just didn't, he wanted to get through it, and hit the high points. And Ray wanted to, take you on a leisurely journey through those stories. So just people could do all kinds of things with it.
So you were talking about there being, 5 or 7 subgenres that you found of Jack Tales?
Yeah, and I'll come back to a thread that I picked up and then dropped. There was a fellow named Donald Davis, who's now one of the most, one of the best known storytellers in the American festival world. And when I came to North Carolina in '83, Donald was telling a kind of a mixture of personal stories that he worked up into repertoire pieces and these jack tales, which he had gotten from his, primarily from his grandmother in a very isolated section of the Blue Ridge, about 70 miles southwest of Beech Mountain. So I was fascinated by his jack tales, and most people in the festival world were fascinated by his personal stories. So when I wrote my thesis, it was about, it centered on Donald and his jack tales. And a few years later, he published a book of those stories, which is called, originally it was called Jack Always Seeks His Fortune, and now it's just called Southern Jack Tales, which has some of the similar stories from Chase, but it also has a lot of different stories. And combining those two repertoires in my calculations, I came up with 7 different sort of subgenres of jack tales. And the first, the most, kind of basic entryway subgenre is the nursery rhyme. There are a whole lot of nursery rhyme jack stories that are little rhyme fragments that start introducing you to the kind of the elements, the basic elements of story, like.
And you talk about like literal rhymes, like Jack and Jill went up the hill.
Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after, which is a basic fool story. You go out into the world, you try your hand, you fail, or you fall. And that's the fool story in a seed. It's not even a nutshell, it's a seed. And then there are so you go through a whole lot of those rhymes. Some of the rhymes are trickster stories, like Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick, which is, a little portrait of the trickster hero. And some of them are little kind of archetypal pictures, like Jack is alive like me, let him go out, saddle pack me, in which Jack is just an ember out of the fire, passed from hand to hand. And the one in whose hand the ember dies gets kind of crucified with household objects hung all over him.
Oh, wow.
So, there's a little mythic piece of lore that's very old, that's subsisting in that rhyme. And then, you get the fool stories, and there's a whole little repertoire of Jack fool stories, like Jack's first job, or Jack, the story where Jack trades, he gets a lump of gold and he trades it for a horse, and then he trades the horse for a cow, and he trades the cow for a pig, and trades the pig for and eventually deals himself down to he's got nothing but a flint rock for a doorstop. And he stops at a well for a drink of water, and he knocks the flint rock into the well, and now he's got nothing for all that trouble. But Jack, in Donald Davis's version, which is quite brilliant, Jack says, well, now there's nothing in the way of my seeking my fortune. And off he goes down the road, So that fool story is the next entry level for jack tales. And then you get the trickster story, which is the next developmental level. And then you get this fairy tale hero who starts opening himself up to spiritual values. Instead of just tricking the giant, and cutting off his head, he has to listen to the birds, listen to the voices of the wind and the animals and the nature. And he has to listen to the advice of his elders, who appear to be useless to everybody else, but actually they have wisdom. So that next level of spiritual development is the Wonder Tales. And then there's a sort of once you've had your Wonder Tale developed, then you have your Tall Tale Jack Tales, and there are a number of those where Jack just kind of bullshits his way to fortune. And there's the what they call the fablio in folklore tradition, which are adult trickster tales that have to do with sex and the lower functions of the body, but the kind of stuff you get into when you're grown up. And Donald Davis had a number of those, which are pretty unusual, things that date back to Chaucer and to the taverns of the 13th century, and the pilgrimage routes and things like that. And then, you put them all together and you get a kind of a mythic tapestry of Jack, in which Jack performs the functions of a culture hero. And Donald had a number of these stories which were quite esoteric. And looking at the chat, I'll get to those questions for sure. But for example, Donald told a Jack Tale version of the story of Taliesin, who is, captive in the underworld and has to feed the fire while the witch goes up to the world and collects all the healing plants and brings them down, boils them down into 6 drops. And on the last day, she goes up one more time to make sure she didn't miss anything. And that's when Jack is stirring the pot. And there's an old man who's feeding the fire, gets the fire too hot, and 3 of those drops sputter and leap over the lip of the pot and onto Jack's forearm, just like culture heroes through time, like Finn McCool or Taliesin. And he bites down into his flesh, and he gets all the wisdom in the world. And they do a magic chase, and it's the story that everybody knows. But in Donald's version, the old witch gives birth to Jack after swallowing him up after the magic chase. And she wants to kill him and, dice him up and eat him and maybe get her power that way, but she can't do it because he just looks at her. And like women throughout time, she's undone and she can't harm him. But all she can do is bring him down to the beach at low tide and lay him there in a bag, in a hog's bladder in this version, that she sealed over with pitch. And she lays him down, she turns her back and she says, I don't know what happened to him. So the tide comes in, picks him up and washes him out to sea. And instead of him winding up in the salmon nets of King Gwithno, in Donald's version, he floats all the way to the shores of the Outer Banks of North Carolina and washes up there. And that's how Jack came to America, which some very creative storyteller had a hand in that somewhere.
Yes, which may have been Donald, or may not.
It may well have been Donald, or I would be really surprised if Donald's grandmother, who never left that holler in Haywood County, was the one who made that adaptation, because, well, it's a pretty sophisticated piece of work. But it does show that the Jack Tale cycle is a suitable home for mythic motifs. And Donald had a number of those. So, as a cycle, I think the mythic element is the way Jack, as a kind of an archetypal figure, becomes an influence over people's lives and becomes a kind of a guiding figure, a guiding light in the world of story that then somehow infiltrates or influences the world that we actually walk in. And Ray was an example of that, and Donald was another.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, so Kaz says, and I Kaz sort of put this as questions at the end, but it just really fits with everything that we've been talking about, which is just that presence. And I've heard it said about Duncan and now Ray, what is the essence of it, and the stance and the body movement and the audience connection and maybe enthusiasm. But because I've said that many times about Duncan, and you've said it about kind of Ray, and I would say a lot of it is just about being absolutely who you are.
Yeah.
And just like they have those kind of people, and I don't think you get that kind of weight until you reach a certain age. But not everybody gets it at all.
Right.
And it's an ability to be completely confident in who you are and what you have to offer, and not giving an absolute damn about what anybody else thinks about you, because what you've got is special.
Yeah.
People want it, and if they don't want it, they can.
Yeah,
exactly what you said about was it Jimmy Carson?
If Johnny Carson wants to talk to me so bad, let him come down here. And he just did. Fame and fortune was not his primary value, but actually going to the woods and picking galax and seeing the patterns of life unfolding under his feet was much more important to him.
And that's the other thing that they really had in common. And the other man that I've met like that actually was my granddad, who who also grew up in story and monologue and music, also had kind of a very tough life and a life of kind of, actually he did make kind of quite a lot of money at one point and lost it all, you know, and kind of really knew what it was to be poor, but had a real connection with the land. All those three men, just, they knew the land, they knew the seasons, they knew the turnings, and they'd all experienced loss and just carried on, because that's how life is. And it's just, you know, you have times of spring and summer, and you have times of winter, and you roll with it, and it will change, and that is a natural part of life. And everything that you said about the leaves coming up from the Gaelic and the root being there all of the time, and having that connection to the root, and knowing that that's kind of some bit of your family or some bit of your knowledge will always be there, and that you are just connected to that eternal and to the land beneath your feet. And that's, I mean, and I think that's the really interesting thing with Ray and Duncan, is that obviously Duncan was a traveller, and that's the essence of a traveller, is that people do have this thing about a lot of travellers, they don't expect there to be that connection with the land. When you've got somebody like Ray, who's just lived in that same place all of his life, and really got to know somewhere exceptionally well. But with the travellers, they are out in the land all of the time, and actually they don't travel in straight lines. They go in circles, or kind of like I mean, the way I tend to think of it, like you've kind of got a winter base, and then you might not go the same way every year, but kind of there's circular journeys like petals that always come back to that winter base, and you get to know that land and the people exceptionally well.
And the rivers and the crops and the cycles and the time of the seasons. That was, and they're very connected to the earth. And Stanley was that way too, Stanley Robertson. An extremely mystical kind of sensibility, so that when he talked about Jack, you could feel this kind of angelic presence around the stories, and that's a kind of mythic consciousness around the stories. Whether the story itself is a culture hero story like Finn McCool or Taliesin, or if it's just that presence of Jack within it, which is this eternal self-renewing kind of child archetype.
And Duncan didn't talk about it as much as Stanley did. Stanley talked about the goddess of Mother Nature a lot. But when you talk to Duncan about religion and kind of, well, what mattered to the travellers, I mean, they were very Christian and absolutely had this huge connection with the Christ story, you know, and had their own versions of the birth of Jesus and everything, because obviously Jesus and his family were travelers, you know, kind of they obviously were. They're just there with the donkey and they're going from place to place. They're born in a stable. He's just like a natural hero for the but he would also Mother Nature, and he wouldn't talk about that a great deal, and kind of and he wouldn't talk about that necessarily to everybody, but definitely Mother Nature was kind of this is our goddess, and this is what we worship, and the ground beneath our feet, and kind of, you know, and that being, and literally being the mother of all of us. I'm just looking at Norman. Yes, Norman has he sent me this list of Jack Tales, and it's fantastic. So it'd be really helpful, Norman, if you wanted to put that on the chat, it would be great. And I'll put it up on my Facebook page afterwards as well. So if you're too busy listening and you can't do the cut and paste thing now, it's fine. I will be on my site, but you can get it here now. So
Mike Rust had a question in there. Did they only tell Jack tales? In other words, was it all Jack? And that, no, not exactly. Although, you know, some of the male storytellers, particularly, you know, people like Ray, were very involved. You know, Jack took up a lot of space in his imagination. But Ray also told personal stories, some. And late in life, when he was on his last illness, which, I mean, he went to this, I tell about meeting Ray at the Johnson City Medical Center, where he came to have some medical attention when he was already quite sick. And he just took over the hospital. But they gave him 6 months, you know, very generous of them. And 2 years later, he was still talking. And 18 months in, it looked like he was getting ready to breathe his last. And there's a very famous story that's going around the circuit in America about when everyone was gathered around the bedside saying goodbye, including this hospice nurse who had become, you know, very dear. They'd become very dear to each other. And everybody left the room, and the hospice nurse took out his harmonica to say a last farewell to Ray. His breathing was becoming shallower and shallower and slower. And the nurse put the harp to his lips and began to play Amazing Grace as slowly as he could, to draw it out, to not wanting to say goodbye, but this was his last goodbye. And as the last note resounded in that hospital room, Ray opened his eyes, sat up and said, "Now that's spirit." And he began singing and telling stories. And, I didn't hear about this. The next day I was on my way to say my goodbye. And I got to the hospital room and Ray was sitting up in bed singing all 30 verses of Beau Lambkin, which is, one of the child ballads, one of the longest and most. And it was a kind of a fractured version. He had, little bits of this verse and that verse, but he kept on going all the way from beginning to end. He wasn't going to give up. And Amazing Grace just brought him back for 6 more months. So he was pretty one of a kind of character. But Mike asked about, were there other stories? Yes, there were least gal or youngest daughter stories like White Bear, which is an Appalachian version of East of the Sun, West of the Moon, and Mutzmag, who was, youngest, best trickster girl. And there were a number of those female heroines, which I like those stories a lot too. And Donald liked them too. So he kind of rewove a number of those, non-Jack Wonder tales. Donald had a version of Sleeping Beauty, which was more like the Basile version from the Pentamerone, with this Sleeping Beauty had like 7 shifts that were all had myriad pearl buttons all down the front, and she was going to be married to an ogre, and he was trying to unbutton all of her shifts and finally get her out of it. And it took ages, but that is a brilliant version. I wish Donald still told more of those stories, because he was really had an amazing imagination. Whether they all came from grandmother or whether Donald had just picked those up and put them in his own milieu, ultimately, that's not an issue to me as the creative imagery and imagining of those stories. Although I think for Donald, it was hard because he came into his storytelling when he around a lot of folklorists, and there was a definite kind of a scale of value where if it came from your grandmother, it was by definition a better story than if you adapt it to your own storytelling world yourself. And that's not the situation. It doesn't do a lot for
honesty, does it?
No, so it was real. It must have been a bind, I think, on some level.
There was a certain thing, sort of, kind of when I first started storytelling, I think Rory McLeod sort of said to me, well, tell it to your grandmother and get her to tell it back to you, and then it'll be traditional, it'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, that's it. And a lot of traditional storytellers, actually, both in Scotland and in America, have had no compunction about making up their own Jack tales. Herbert Halpert, this guy who wrote the notes to Chase's book, used to visit a fellow named Sam Harmon, who was another grandson of Council Harmon. And Sam was up in his 80s at this time. This is the late 30s. And he said, well, my audience, the people I tell my stories to, that's my grandkids. And they are constantly, they're after me for stories all the time. They want stories, more stories. And when I've run through all my stories, they still want more stories. So I have to make them up. They have something to tell them. And so he did. It's just, like any professional performer with an audience, you have to please the people in the seats. And it happened to be his grandkids. So, he didn't get called, he didn't get on the folklorist index for that.
But particularly the tall tales are being made up all the time anyway.
All the time.
That's part of the tradition, is kind of, because you've got to top them all the time. So they're always changing and moving on there. And the point of a tall tale is to be topical and to point fun at people. I mean, that's the joy of it.
Yeah. And Donald had people like that in his family. An uncle, Uncle Frank Davis, was apparently a great yarn spinner, and he'd make up stories all the time. And Donald took after that more than he did his, eventually, because his grandmother's stories, the traditional stories, they didn't really, and this is going to sound harsh in a British context, they didn't work as well in the festival world because American audiences wanted to hear about themselves, basically.
Right.
And hearing about Jack was just a little bit too removed from their experience. Even though there were definite connoisseurs of folktales and mythology on that circuit. But as the audience grew and became more general, and it became less the storytelling aficionados and connoisseurs and fanatics whose primary interest was folklore, and it became just people who were interested in their own experience. When Donald talked about himself and his grandmother, his actual grandmother, or his actual mother and his actual father, that got them in the seats, and it got them off the seats to give him a standing ovation. Yeah. And when he went, he had been a minister, a Methodist minister, and when he went full time as a storyteller, it was on the wings of those very highly crafted personal stories.
It's so interesting though, isn't it? Because I think of Jack as being the everyman, the kind of the one that doesn't go out of date, that is always relevant, that always has to do something about the current political situation that absolutely resonates with everybody. Everybody can, like you say, everybody has been Jack or can be Jack, or it's so relatable, and actually much more relatable because he's generic than something specific. And I suppose that is a real cultural difference, which is because we've talked a lot about the similarities, and we're running out of time. We're probably over time, but anybody who comes to Taking the Tradition regularly will know this is a kind of storytelling hour-ish. It usually goes on just a little bit over, because we always just get to interesting points as the time runs out. It's like, well, we'll just do a little bit more. So we've talked a lot about the similarities, and one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about is that, I've been thinking a lot about Jack stories lately, and we had Heather Ewell on Taking the Tradition on a few weeks ago. Yeah, she was saying about this.
Heather's Barbara McDermott's daughter, so
absolutely.
I was talking about her articles that were very important. So,
and she was telling a Jack story event in Scotland, and somebody came up and said, "Why isn't there a female Jack? Why is there not? Why is there not a female contemporary?" And she was going, "Well, it's just because it's Jack, and Jack is everybody, whether you're male or female." And she started thinking about, do I have a problem with that? No, I don't. And there are female, like you said, there's lots of female heroes, but they all have a different name. There's Molly Whuppie.
They have no name. Yeah. A lot of them are just the youngest girl.
They do in Scottish Traveller, I think, and quite often it's Mary, but they tend to have, they're very distinct heroes. So there's Dauntless Mary, or they're not generic in the same way that Jack is. And I've just been really thinking about this, and what I realised is that for me, that female side really comes out in Jack's mother. Right. And Jack's mother is just the balance to Jack in all of the Scottish Traveller stories. She is so integral. She might not have as much story time, you don't hear as much about her, but her influence is over the entire arc. Yeah. And the way that she sets it up, and kind of this whole beginning where there isn't a dad and she's done everything, and Jack is the youngest son, like the others have been out playing in the yard, and Jack's the one who's kind of stayed by the fire. He's the ash lad. He's the one who's been in the kitchen listening to the stories. Yeah. He's the one that kind of, his mother's going, "Do you want the whole bannock or the half a bannock?" And Jack's going, "I'm not going to leave you with no food. I'm gonna take the half a bannock, and your blessing or your curse is kind of irrelevant, because if I take the whole bannock, I know that leaves you with nothing." And there's so many things that Jack's balance out, but I don't know if that's the same in the Appalachian story.
Interesting. I think that depends on the teller, because the teller meditates his or her way into the stories and decides what's important. The story is a loose structure, and you can enter it, like with Shona Lee's stories, she enters and leaves the stories at all kinds of points, and it's her decision, as well as sometimes the audience's decision, where to come and go. Elizabeth Ellis is a storyteller who grew up in Kentucky in eastern Kentucky. So it's that same Appalachian belt. And when she tells the story, she puts a lot of emphasis on Jack's mother. That's a figure in those stories that she values. And because she values it, she brings it into high relief. But Donald, not so much, or Ray, not so much. I think for them, the female figure that's more magnetic is the love interest, the love object, the anima figure, as it were, the figure of desire.
That's the thing. Yes. So does that person tend to be a character then, or are they a love object?
Well, oftentimes they're asleep.
Yeah. So they're not really a character then. They're just like, another.
Well, sometimes they are. Yeah. Like the story about when Jack has to do a whole lot of tasks to have his bride. And the bride, comes to Jack at night and says, "You'll be offered 2 shovels, a new one and an old one. Take the old one." She's the figure of wisdom in those stories. So she does come out in that way, in those particular stories. I'm really fascinated with the youngest daughter. Like my favorite story, and as it happens, Donald's as well, was White Bear, which is the Beauty and the Beast story. But that's the youngest daughter story. And it's incredibly powerful, especially to tell to groups of women. The end where things, after things become really hopeless, and the old woman in the yard spinning says, "Well, gal," says, "I see you've had trouble, but you ain't seen nothing yet."
Oh, great.
When you're in the deepest trouble you've ever been in, said, "You'll have these 3 gold nuts." And what 3 gold nuts? That sounds wonderful, but what do I do with them? Don't do nothing with them till you're in the worst trouble you've ever been in, and then you can start opening them up, and you'll have some relief. So the girl takes the 3 gold nuts, and at the end of the story, well, I won't ruin it for you, but as those 3 gold nuts are opened, there's a real kind of a absolution that happens with all of her suffering. It's a very, very powerful set of images. So it's definitely there, and it's in that was there's no doubt that was a traditional story that made its way into the Appalachians. It was told on Beech Mountain. It was told in Southwest Virginia. There were other stories like
there's definitely Scottish variants of that as well.
Yeah. The story that's known in Wise County, Virginia, as Jack and King Maroc, or King Mark. It has elements of Tristan. It has elements of the female figure in that, the sorcerer's daughter, or the devil's daughter, who's Mary, and they're African-American Jack tales on the Georgia Sea Islands and the South Carolina Sea Islands, where it's Jack and Mary. Sometimes Mary is Jack's sister. Sometimes she's the love object. And she is a figure.
We don't have a Jack's sister. Yeah. And we might saying Jack's daughter, but I'm thinking, there's one story I can think of where Jack has a daughter. One. Yeah. There's one story where Jack is an old man and he has a daughter. Right. I can't think of anywhere he has a sister.
Yeah. No, that's very unusual. The Jack and King Maroc story, she's the love object, and she's the one who keeps coming out and saying, "Jack, do it this way." And of course he ignores her and does it the other way and gets in real deep shit until she comes out and says, "Jack, did you do it my way?" He says, "Oh, why would I do it that way?" And she says, "Well, because you're in deep shit. Watch me do it." And she does it. And at the end, she delivers the whole, she takes him on the magic flight, and she says, take these objects out of the horse's ear and throw it behind you. And he gets, a mountain rises, and a lake appears, and brambles appear. So she's that figure of wisdom in that story.
I want to hear the story, but we are
pretty much no sister.
9:00, and and Other people saying, yeah, we want to hear the story. What I do have is really good news for you all, because Joseph is going to be one of the guests on the Get a Word in Edgeways concert, which a week on Thursday, which I think is the 9th of July. So we will be getting to hear a story from him then, and it is a free concert. Look on the Get a Word in Edgeways, I'll Get a Word in online page, and you will get details of that. It'll be on my page as well, that you can just click the link. It's 8:30 on a week on Thursday. It is a little bit late. We were avoiding the clapping. Soon as we change the time, everybody stop clapping. Never mind.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for taking on the tradition and taking on the technology too.
Well, thank you very much. And just looking, I mean, so I have got more questions, but if there was anybody who did have a burning last question for Joseph, this is your chance to get in very, very, very quickly. Well, I'm just checking the rest of the chat. I mean, it definitely sounds like I need to have a conversation with Mike Rust, who's going, there's loads of stories where Jack has a daughter, and going, I don't know those stories. I don't know if they're Travellers ones. And Norma's saying is Duncan's Traveller Jack books are missing, as the list was for someone who knows those books already. Obviously, Duncan has got a book of just Jack Tales out. So Duncan has about 16 books, and one of those is just Jack Tales. But there are Jack Tales in some of the other books as well. I would definitely recommend The Thorn and the King's Foot as one of the best Duncan books as well, if you're interested, just to add this onto the fantastic list of Jack books that Norman's posted up.
Yeah, thank you, Norman. The Jack in Two Worlds book, there are 2 essays in that book that I wrote, one on Ray and one on Donald, but it's also a great collection of other variants and other branches of the Jack Tale tradition around North America. And the Lindahl book on Jack Tales and other North American Martian is great. The Chuck Perdue, well, I got stories about Chuck Perdue. He was great. Gail Haley was a little like Chase. She was someone who took great liberties with the tradition. Jack's daughter. Mike, you're going to have to tell those stories to me.
Yeah, I think me, you, Mike, and are just going to have a great little chat together.
Absolutely.
We're gonna get all of these out of you, but the time is marching, and it's just gone so quickly tonight, and I just want to start telling stories, and so I could swap stories now all night, and just change the put the Jack stories backwards and forwards. So maybe we'll just have to sort out a night when we can just have a Jack Kaylee.
Okay, that sounds great.
You, me, and Mike, and if anybody else is here as well who wants to come and tell some Jack stories, and we'll just go around and just do Jack Tales. And maybe we'll try and even do it in those kind of 7 steps, because that sounds like it sounds like a typical night at Duncan's, actually. Kind of that peak of the Wonder Tale, and then things start to slide downhill into tall tales and dodgy sex.
Totally scurrilous. Yeah. Sex and scatology starts rearing their heads.
Sal, I would love you to come to a Jack Kaylee. So nice to have had you here, Sal. And Kath, and it's just thank you to everybody who's come. Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the chat, and just thank you for the entertaining conversation and making me think. And it's given me lots and lots to chew on. But there will be plenty more happening. So I will be back here next week with an entirely different tradition. I think Duncan's just going to have a little rest for a week, because next week we were talking a little bit about Shona Lee. And for those of you who don't know Shona Lee, I think everybody on here probably does, but she's sort of known as the last Jewish Drusilla. So it's a female tradition of stories that are all just cycles that all interconnect, thousands and thousands of stories. And like you say, you can kind of enter at one point, and it could be a totally different route through each time, though she does try and keep the arc of a story. So we're going to talk about how she learned that and about that tradition next week. And she's also going to be my guest at Blast on the 10th of July. So next week is my busy week. It's going to be great. So Tuesday, the Shona Lee undertaking on the tradition. Thursday night is Get a Word in Edgeways, the wonderful Joseph Sobol, but also we've got other poets and storytellers. So we've got Jean Atkin and Kathy Wallace, Bard of Cornwall, and Kate Innes. So that'll be a really fantastic night. And then Shona Lee at Blast on the Friday night. I think that's all the notices. So I'll let you sink back into Jack. Hopefully everybody's had time to copy the list of Jack tales off the
Right.
chat. If you haven't.
Speaking of those books, I have a book coming out shortly called Liars, Damn Liars, and Storytellers.
Oh,
which is
fantastic.
a twisted Mark Twain quote, but it has a whole, about a third of the book is essays on the Jack tale tradition, both that essay on the 7 phases of Jack, but also a couple of pieces on Ray Hicks and on the tradition after Ray in the generations that follow. So
when you say soon,
what's that?
When you say soon,
it's coming out around the end of July from University of Tennessee Press.
And it'll be available over here as well?
Well, through the mercies of Amazon, yeah, absolutely.
Well, sometimes it's better to get them from Storytellers direct, and then you get more pennies from it. But it sounds like maybe easier from Amazon.
I'm not going to earn a cent on this darn thing, I'm afraid. But get it where you can.
So pre-order it now. And then hopefully, which I think is what I'm going to go and do, pre-order it at Amazon. So more fantastic reading to come. The rest of the list I will stick up on my Facebook page. But for now, just on behalf of everybody else who's been saying how wonderful you are and what a great night, just woohoo! Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, and good night all.
Bye-bye now.